There's a very subtle migration that occurs away from that kernel, that vision, that mission that initially started us off. Now we start paying attention to the business process. And we move away from being a mission with a business as a delivery mechanism. And now we've got a business with a mission as an afterthought.
Blaine, thank you for joining us today. Could you share a little bit about your backstory and what inspired you to pursue compassionate capitalism, as you put it, and how that shaped your direction for your career?
Wow. How to begin that? Well, I'll just start with compassionate capitalism as the end point and back up from there. Compassion it's impossible for me to be compassionate about something that I don't feel connected to. So just with that as a thesis, connection informed the whole genesis of the book. And real early in my career, and this goes back, when I first came out of university back in the 1970s, which is why my hair is as color as that it is. I got involved, obviously, in business. My undergraduate work was in marketing and international business. And it occurred to me pretty quickly on that most organizations in some way, shape, or form were toxic to the human spirit. The whole industrial revolution notion of we need cogs to fit into this industrial wheel that produces an output of either service or product, and you're one of the cogs in the wheel, and you're replaceable. Okay, these cogs are replaceable. And the whole idea of people are our greatest asset, people are our greatest resources when I started paying attention to that, assets are depreciated on a balance sheet and resources are meant to be used. So people have had the experience and still do have the experience of being depreciated and used. And that's where the toxicity kind of crept in. So I started looking at, different organizations, and some of them seem to actually be doing something a little different. And so when I started exploring that a little bit, these were organizations that were led by people that had recognized in some way that everything's connected. How my people feel about themselves makes a difference in terms of how we work and ultimately the culture that we develop. And I started really paying a lot of attention to that. And then I got, and then fast forward a whole bunch of years, I was talking to John Mackey, who was the co-founder of Whole Foods, and Raj Sisodia, who was a professor of business at Babson College out in the East Coast here in the U.S. And Raj and John had written a book called Conscious Capitalism. And in my conversations with them, collectively, but also independently, I remember, just sitting with Raj and having, some in-depth conversation about this. Consciousness is one thing. Consciousness about we've got a greater stakeholder environment than most of us will pay attention to. And most, particularly publicly traded companies, we pay attention to the shareholders. And their invitation was, no, you need to become conscious that there's a ripple out here, that it's a bigger pool that you're actually playing in than what you might myopically be thinking of. And my point with them in the conversations was consciousness and awareness of that is only one piece. What's the behavioral analog? How do people actually behave as a consequence of that realization that there's a bigger notion, we're connected to something bigger here. And that's where compassion, kind of came into the mix. And if we look at, and this is, boy, you get me on a soapbox here and I start running. But if I go all the way back to when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the Wealth of Nations contained in it, and if you look at the cover of this book, Compassionate Capitalism, there's invisible hands under the ground, and one of the things that Adam Smith talked about was the invisible hands of commerce. Well, what most people don't know is that was informed by an earlier book that he wrote called The Theory of Moral Imperative, and it was looking at reciprocity as one of the linchpins to nature's thriving, nature's ability to thrive. Reciprocity. The moral imperative is to thrive. It's not just to survive. So what do we do in an economic model that ensures thriving as a possibility? You need to have that kind of reciprocity that's fundamentally linked to a realization, a consciousness of connection. So that's kind of the philosophical underpinnings of how I came to write this book, Compassionate Capitalism.
Thank you for sharing that backstory. That's really, it makes a lot of sense. And when you mention that business is charged with taking responsibility for the well being of the whole and how we're all kind of connected to something bigger, could you point to a specific moment or experience where this philosophy crystallized for you?
One in particular, Union Carbide, Bhopal, India, the gas leak that ended up killing thousands of people. It was one of the most catastrophic industrial accidents. If we take Chernobyl off the map and 3 Mile Island off the map, this was something that could have been avoided. There were cost cutting measures put in place in service of a short term monetary realization. Okay. And the shareholders needed to be satisfied. So there was just a lot of things that went on with that. The implication of taking responsibility for the whole is to begin thinking past quarterly results. And again, it kind of goes back to how do I behave as a consequence of recognizing that I'm connected to my community in this case. If I'm Union Carbide running this plant in Bhopal, India, I'm connected to the well-being of the people that are not only working in the plant, but the well-being of the community that supports these people that are working in the plant. So if I'm making cost-cutting decisions that put them in jeopardy, that's a non-starter. It absolutely. I mean, I may need to start making, and it fundamentally comes down to I make harder decisions. Compassion is not a soft, squishy sort of thing. It actually compels leaders to make hard choices in service of the well-being of all life on the planet. And I think that's the purpose of business, David, is to ensure the thriving of all life on the planet. That's the purpose of business, to ensure the thriving of all life on the planet. And I don't care if you're selling pizzas or if you're a dry cleaner or whatever your business is. If people feel like you've got their best interest at heart, they will beat a door to your product or service.
That sounds very nice. And I would like to believe that and adopt that perspective. But what are some of the biggest misconceptions leaders might have about this compassionate capitalism, as you put it, especially those in smaller or growing businesses where it feels like there's a lot more competition?
Well, first of all, the challenge is competition as a mindset. Nature doesn't compete. I mean, I use nature. I grew up on a farm, and for me, nature is the only truly free market system that you can find. It has no artificial constraints unless they're imposed by man. Okay, nature, it just works. Everything in nature is recycled in some way, shape, or form. Nothing competes inordinately. Now, there's, not to say that there's not competitive dynamics in play, particularly around scarce food and that sort of stuff, but that's all part and parcel of the whole way that it works. And it's a naturally occurring phenomena. Mostly, it all works around cooperation as a primary model. Everything in nature is cooperative to a degree. We look at it as a snapshot and we see competition, but you take the bigger picture. It's a cooperative, synergistic overlay. Everything is got its place, and everything is contributing from its place. So whether I'm a large company or a small company, when I start looking at how do I cooperate and collaborate with my key stakeholders, my vendors, my customers, my employees, my community. How do I cooperate? How do I collaborate with them? That starts to, become a different kind of a game rather than just focusing on, am I making money this quarter?
You've mentioned the soul of business and how that is a non replicable competitive advantage. Could you explain what you mean by that and how SMBs practically can tap into it?
The soul of any business is that kernel. First of all, it's the spark that initiated the building of the organization to begin with. I had an idea about a product or a service that I wanted to take to market. That kernel of something here that looks for expression. That's what a soul of a business is. And what happens over the course of the life cycle of many businesses is that first spark is inspirational. And if the leader is really tapped into it from an inspirational perspective, they start attracting people that want to be a part of this game. They want to be a part of this business. And Then we build the business to deliver on the product or service promise. At some point, we get over the revenue hump. We're revenue positive, and we start paying attention to business processes. And there's a very subtle migration that occurs away from that kernel, that vision, that mission that initially started us off. Now we start paying attention to the business process. And we move away from being a mission with a business as a delivery mechanism. And now we've got a business with a mission as an afterthought. And what we lose is connection to that inspirational kernel that gave us existence to begin with. And that's where we have difficulties as businesses, is when we lose connection to the soul of who we are. And the soul, in the way I define it here, has to do not with any religious connotation. It's that piece without which we couldn't exist. That piece without which, if it's not present, we don't exist.
What do you mean by we? Could you unpack that a little bit?
The we, the company. And it's true for an individual too. When I lose my connection to my soul, I start to wither and die. I become a shell.
So your individuality, the thing that makes you Blaine and no one else. Could you talk about how a company's soul impacts, or perhaps should impact, day-to-day operations like hiring practices, strategic planning, leadership development, stuff like that?
Well, let's just take Costco as an example. They've been in the news lately. Big box retailer, in the U.S. and Canada, around the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion identity. They have landed on we're not walking away from DEI. As a matter of fact, they put a vote up a couple of days ago to their shareholders about, do we want to keep DEI as part of who we are in terms of our operational dynamic. 98% of the shareholders said yes. Do not let go of that. Keep on to this. And in the face of a political headwind where people are saying, particularly the Trump administration, get rid of DEI. You're woke if you're doing that. I mean, all that stuff. It's consistent with their core value. And this is what they've actually defined. It's consistent with our core values. That's who we are. DEI is not antithetical to their core value. As a matter of fact, it informs their hiring decisions. It informs, just kind of how we do things, not from a prescription of formulaic, we need X number of Asian Americans. We need X number of Afro-Americans. We need, that's not what they're doing with this. They're saying we want to pay attention to diversity because that's where our strength is. Our strength, our valuing, our value that we bring to the marketplace is through our ability to understand broad market implications, broad demographic implications. So DEI is a mechanism by which we actually begin to bring that back home in a way that we can operationalize it.
A lot of things come up when you said that. One is this general assumption. I guess myself and I would assume many, if not most, are making assumptions all the time as predictions for, if I say this, what's the likely response? If I do this, what's the likely return, etc. I think that most of us want to be compassionate. Most of us would love global thriving. And I feel like a lot of the friction on the surface level seems to be on the terms that we use to communicate underlying needs. And I'm curious what your thoughts were with that. Do you also see us as basically wanting the same things, but arguing over how it's defined?
I think fundamentally, every human being on this planet, literally every human being on this planet, wants to feel as if they are valued, wants to feel as if they are valuable. We want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want to be safe. I mean, these are universal needs that we have as a human species, and it's not culturally dependent. It's not ethnically dependent. It's just kind of, and I don't think it's just the human species that has this compulsion to be recognized, to be seen, to be significant, to whatever label you want to have on it. The question about how we do that is where we get ourselves wrapped around the axle. And what literally becomes problematic is when the leaders that we elevate begin to be self-serving, and they begin to aggregate power because power is what they believe is they needed in order to move things. Power is not needed to move things. Empathy, compassion will move things. And I don't know how long the species has been on the planet. We can go back to Cro-Magnon man here, I suppose, but we've learned some things about how not to do stuff, endless wars, and I mean, all of these sorts of things. We recognize that there are things in place, but we don't learn from them. We keep repeating the cycle. And this is where, if we can just kind of take our foot off the gas a minute and take a breath and go, what do we really want? What's a worthy ideal that we can aspire to? That's where I think leadership, effective leadership, starts to come into play. And I define leadership in this way. It's the process, and literally the process, effective leadership, the process of influencing others, which takes command and control out of the game. I'm influencing others in order to co-create. Ownership transfers. Ideas now become not mine, it becomes ours. Influencing in order to co-create coordinated movement. When we start moving into new territory, we're going to step on each other's toes. How do we do that without calling for war? It's kind of like, no, yeah, we've just got preferences here. Let's, and preferences are based on assumptions that, will end up creating conclusions. I'm right, you're wrong, and we bump heads. Find a way to drop back down to the assumptions here so we can clarify and keep things moving in pursuit of a worthy ideal. Something that's out there that we can aspire to. So influencing, how do I influence? Well, it's a state of being move. Who am I? Most people on this planet are not familiar with who they are. They don't know themselves well. Most people on this planet do not know themselves well. And the more I know myself, the more facile I become in terms of how I actually work with the people that I find myself, living and working with.
You're involved with so many things. Avatar Resources, that's avatar-resources.com, as well as the C-Suite Network, which you alluded to, I believe. You're the host over there. Is there anything that you would like to point the audience toward?
I've got my podcast, The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. Love to have you drop in and give a listen. We've got a mastermind program coming up that begins on February 17th. This may or may not air in time for people to look at that, but you can certainly go to my website, blainebartlett.com, and find out more information about that.
Wonderful. We'll put those links in the show notes, as well as perhaps overlaid on the screen. And real pleasure talking with you. Thanks for your time and insights. Here's one more step to knowing ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you, David. This has been a wonderful interview. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
My pleasure.